Welcome to the next section of Hilchos Basar b'chalav. We are continuing in Siman Pei Zion in chapter 87. We are on Seif Hey in the Shulchan Aruch. We're going to go through a new item that is found in some animals that could be pertinent to the laws of Basar b'chalav. So we're going through again which types of meat are considered applicable to the laws of Basar b'chalav, and in hay we're going to talk about eggs. So it's not just any egg. So hay starts off with beitzim hanimtzaim me'ophos, chicken eggs that are inside of the chicken. Okay, or really any bird eggs. Imheim gemuros, if they are fully fashioned, dahainu, which means to say, sheish lahem chelbon v'chelmon. They have the yellow part and they have the white part, right? They have a full egg. Alpha pishahimu uro begidin, even though it is fully intertwined with little strings attached. Okay, so the egg in this situation hasn't developed a shell, but is completely fully formed. Such an egg is fully formed and is permitted to be eaten with milk. Aval im ein la ela chelmon, but if it's missing the white and is only the yellow part, so it's only the yolk, asar levashlam b'chalav, that is not permitted to be cooked with milk. So don't make an omelet with it. Aval im achlan bifnei atzman muter lechol achreihem gvina o chalav. But if they are eaten on their own, so you take them out of the chicken, let's say, or out of the duck, or whatever bird you shecht, and you take those out, you may go ahead and eat milk and meat with them. So let's go through the source of this rule cited in the Shulchan Aruch, talking about an egg. So the Gemara, talking about an egg, is found in all places, Beitza, right? Gemara Beitza. It's on Zion Amud Aleph, okay, 7a. The Gemara asks the question from the Mishnah: Gufa hashechet shetane goyles v'matzba Beitza gemuros mutaras acham ochalav. Okay, so the Mishnah says that if you find fully formed eggs inside the chicken, after you shecht it, they are permitted to be eaten with milk. Rabbi Yaakov says if they are full of those little attached strings connected to the chicken, you cannot. So Rashi says the following, okay? There's no shell on it. There's no white shell on it, but you have the fully formed yolk, okay? And that's still attached to the chicken's body with the little strands, okay, with those little strands that attach it there. That's permitted. And when we see later on Rabbi Yaakov saying that he disagrees, they're attached to those things, that's prohibited. Okay, so that's Rashi's opinion on how to learn that brisa. Tosfos says, I don't understand. If they're fully formed, why are they still attached? So he disagrees with Rashi's approach, and he's saying that the gemuros is that it's attached still to the yolk of the egg, but the shell hasn't yet formed around it. Okay, and there's no outer membrane, because if you remember, inside of the shell is also a membrane that forms as well. So neither of those things have fully formed yet. Okay, so even here, if there's no shell, it's still not considered good. So therefore, Rabbi Yaakov is saying that if it's attached, that's a problem. Okay, and Tosfos says that some editions don't have the word fully finished, and that actually makes more sense. If you find eggs, they're permitted until Rabbi Yaakov comes and says if they're attached, it's no good. And so it's a different structure altogether. Rabbi Yaakov isn't such a big dispute with the first half of the statement. The Rashba says that in any case of a chicken that you shecht and you find that it has egg yolk and white in it, even if it's still attached to the chicken with these little strands, this is a full egg, and you don't need to salt it like you would other types of meat, and you could even cook it with milk. Okay? But if it's only the yolk and hasn't yet formed the egg white, and even if it's detached from the chicken itself, that's still considered part of the chicken meat itself, right? Like it's still part of the chicken ovaries and is not considered a separate thing, and therefore you can't eat it. And it's also going to require salting. Okay? And this opinion is also echoed by the Ran. The Rashba also brings another approach. Again, this is in the Rashba's work, the Torah Sabayas, which is a work on halacha of these matters. And that other opinion says that it needs to have the shell around it. And that's to say that if it doesn't have that full shell, it's not fully formed. But any time before that, even if it has a fully formed egg and it's inside of a membrane, that's still considered meat and still needs to be salted because it's considered meat. And therefore, it's also prohibited to be eaten with meat. And this opinion is echoed by the Mordechai in the name of the Rashbam. Keep those names in the back of your mind. We're going to need them in a second. Okay, so is Rabbi Yaakov that we're quoting here, is he coming to add something to this brisa, or is he detracting from it? Because we say that he is adding something about these being uros begidin, right? He's saying that they're attached to the body. So now we're going to learn the practical halacha. So the Torah brings this down, and he quotes Rashi and says the following, that even though the yolk has been formed and it's still somewhat red and full of these little strands that attach to the chicken, okay, which he says is attaching it to the shel beitzim, right, the chicken ovaries, or the chicken egg spot, okay, which is attached to the entire formation spot of eggs in the chicken, that's permitted. Okay, and that seems to be because it's just not considered meat, all right, and it hasn't yet detached and started to form the white. The Beis Yosef explains the following, that when the Torah quotes Rashi that this thing is still attached, we're saying that it is attached and not fully finished, but it's already somewhat detached from the main part of the body where the eggs themselves are stored. So it's like moving away far enough where you can say it's not attached like the other things are attached, but it's still close enough that it's, you can still see it there. So it's like moving away where it would be a good reason to say that it's not considered meat anymore. Okay, since it's somewhat reddened and it has these little red stripes in it, it's considered still considered defined as me'ura begidin, right? Still considered attached little strips. And since it is similar to the ones attached, that's why it's called something attached to the overall chicken egg section, the chicken ovary section. Okay, and the Rush calls it that as well. So it looks like them, but it's moving away from them. And the Beis Yosef adds that there is a point that when it separates from the larger collection of eggs, it's not considered fully finished, but since it has already separated, and that's what we're talking about now, so why does it have to say that it has to finish the yolk? So the point is that Rashi is saying is that separating is the main point of it, and it is permitted until it becomes fully formed in that fashion after having separated. Okay, so that's the Beis Yosef's explanation of Rashi. It's like it's not a full egg with the shell, but it's moving far enough away from it that it looks like it's going to be a regular egg, and it doesn't look like the other ones attached to it. So at that point is when we're looking at it being permitted. Okay, and so therefore, if you look at the overall picture of the statement of the Brisa from the Gemara, the Degel Mervava says that Rabbi Yaakov therefore is a leniency, which is that if the egg is no longer full of these little red stripes in them, even though it hasn't fully developed the yolk, has fully developed the yolk, but hasn't fully developed the egg white, it's still permitted to be eaten with milk, and it would still also be required to salt them because it's still considered a little bit like meat. But most people don't like that. So, because most of the poskim, like we saw in Tosfos, seem to say that it means that it's astringency that he's adding. That if it's still attached somewhat, then one should not be eating it with milk because it's considered too close to being part of the chicken itself. Other opinions, like the Pri Chadash, say that Rabbi Yaakov is definitely a stringency, and so therefore, even when the eggs are finished, if they still are attached in some way to the chicken ovary, they are prohibited to be eaten with milk. And this is also echoed by the Shach. The Shach has a longer commentary on the Tur called Ha'aruch Mishach. Okay, it's a long commentary on the Tur, and he also seems to say that that seems to be a little bit difficult. He actually says that the Rishonim who explain that fully formed means that it has to be fully encircled by an eggshell is not really plausible in this case. So, because that would imply that Rabbi Yaakov is coming to disagree with them. So he's going to say a different approach altogether, which we'll see in a little bit. Okay. So let's break it down. So what's considered a fully formed egg? Okay, so Rashi's approach, which we just saw on the tour, he says there's no shell. Okay, there's no outside white shell, and all you have is the yolk, and it's still attached a little bit. That's fine. So his approach is rather lenient, and so therefore, when Rabbi Yaakov disagrees and he says that if it's attached, it's prohibited, he doesn't take that approach. Okay? So what we see over here is that there's a similar opinion between Rashi and the Rashba, which is that it has to have the yolk and the whites to it, and that's considered an egg. Okay? So that's the main thing. But when the yolk is still somewhat attached, that's not really fully finished. Okay, and there has to be the white to it as well. But a lot of people are even willing to say that Rashi might even be more lenient than the Rashba. Okay, so but it sounds like the two of them are very, very similar. The Rambam says that if you shech the bird and you find eggs inside of that are fully formed, you can eat them. Okay, so the Rambam doesn't even mention Rabbi Yaakov's opinion. He just says that if they're fully formed eggs, that's fine. So he doesn't even mention whether or not they have little strands attached to them. And the Beis Yosef says that most people don't even bother with Rabbi Yaakov's opinion. Okay, so, and then the Rav Magid says that echoes that thought on the Rambam as well. So for the Rashba, what's considered a full egg? So it needs both of those things, as we said before. But he adds on Rabbi Yaakov's statement that it can even be attached to the chicken still. So if it doesn't have the white, it's a problem. Now he also brought that other opinion, so that says that it needs to have the shell, which would be the opinion of the Mordechai in the name of the Rashbam. And that doesn't seem to be an appropriate one to bring lahalacha according to him. Okay, so now when it comes to the opinions, the Rosh says over here that even a little bit of attachment to the chicken, as long as they have the whites and the yolks, and is simply separated from the general population of eggs from the ovary itself, that is going to be considered permitted. Okay, but that has to have a fully formed yolk. Okay, so according to them, if it's still attached and not fully formed, according to Rashi and the Rush, then that would be a problem. So having a little bit of the red stripes in there, as we mentioned before, would be a problem. However, the Bach and the Shach and the Pri Chadash all seem to imply that the most lenient opinion would be to approach Rashi as taking the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Even if it does have that, it could still be permitted. So the Rabbeinu Yerucham also echoes he's also another Rishon again who echoes the opinion of Rashi and the Rush. And he says that you have to have both the yolk and the white, okay? And even if it's still somewhat attached. So we mentioned the Ran earlier, holds like the Rashba, okay? And then the Rabbeinu Yohanan, that even without a shell, okay, it's also going to be permitted. Okay, so here's what we see as a result of all of this stuff. You have 4 approaches in the Rishonim. So Rashi says that if you have fully formed eggs, all they need to be considered fully formed is that the yolk is fully formed and that they start to have a little bit of the whites, but it doesn't have to be completely there. Okay? The Rashba is similar to that, but says that the whites have to be completely there. And he also agrees with Rashi that could still be attached somewhat to the actual chicken itself. Okay? Which also means that it doesn't need to be salted. Okay? And you can cook it with milk. So those are 2 important things. Then there's this other opinion in the Rashba, which ends up being the opinion of the Mordechai and the Rashbam, where it needs to have the shell on it. Okay? And then there's one other opinion over here, also that it has to have the membrane around it, and so actually some people posit that this might be the opinion of the Rif, who we haven't mentioned at all in this entire discussion, that he seems to side with Rabbi Yaakov that if it's still attached to the chicken where it's or begidden, it's prohibited. So therefore, they seem to say that if you take Rabbi Yaakov's approach and you apply the general opinion of how people approach his shechitah, then you have to take a stringent approach and assume that it's not really an egg without having the whites and the yolk together. And this opinion would also assume the membrane would be there as well in order for it to satisfy Rabbi Yaakov's opinion. So the Mechaber and the Ramah pass in the following way. So we said that when you find the eggs in the chicken and they're fully formed, he only requires that they have the yolk and the white. Okay? And even if it's somewhat still attached. So he takes that approach to it. Now the Ramah, okay, so he actually doesn't write it here. He writes it elsewhere. So the Ramah, if you look at the Ramah in Siman Ayin Hay, which is in the laws of Malicha, he says that eggs that are found inside of the chicken after shechitah, if they have not fully formed the white, they only have the yolk, they need to be salted. So it seems that the Mechaber and the Ramah do seem to take the approach of the Rashba that we mentioned. Okay, and so since they have those 2 things, the yolk and the whites, they are therefore considered an egg. Okay? And so, therefore, the Gra himself points out that this opinion is consistent with only taking the opinion of the Tanna Kama of the Brisa we cited earlier. So what does this mean? So this means that they don't need to be salted, and it also means that they can be cooked with milk. So the Shach adds the following. He says, even though I understand that this is the opinion of the Shach and the Shach adds, even though this is the opinion of the Ramah and the Mechaber, it's appropriate to not eat them together until it has at least a soft shell over it, which was one of the opinions that we mentioned earlier. Okay, and also that's no longer attached. This is similar to the opinion of the Rashbam, the Mordechai, and other people that are here, including later authorities that we haven't quoted until now, that are sort of the normative Ashkenazi authorities, like the Isser V'Heter, the Maharai, Ha'agos Sha'arei Dura, which is on these different works, are the appropriate works of Ashkenazi descent, and these would then permit one to cook them with milk after they've been that far developed. Okay, but even if they're attached any way, shape, or form to the chicken, you should not permit them to be eaten with milk. So, if there's a real need and they're still attached to the chicken, one could rely on the opinions that we've quoted up until now, Rashi and the Rush and the Tur, all those guys. Fine. And this opinion is also echoed by the Chachmas Adam. Okay. So according to the Shach, you should follow this opinion of the Rashba, which is it should develop at least the shell around it, either the soft shell or a little bit of the white shell. Okay, if you really need to, you could take Rashi's opinion. If you already cook the eggs with milk, okay, and it's not a big loss, as long as you have the yolk and the white, okay, and they have separated from the chicken itself, you could be lenient for that. But if they have not separated from there, you should technically not eat the food after that. Okay? However, so that's the Shach's approach. However, everyone disagrees with the stringency over here. Everyone else disagrees and takes the opinion of the Ramah, which he quotes in his work Torah Shachitas, that you can follow the Rashba even if they have not completely separated from it, you can be lenient. Okay, so he says, however, the Shach also follows up and says that the women of his country, they have to have a full shell on it. Okay, and the Marshal also says that that's the minhag, and so therefore this is a stringency, but such is the minhag, and this is echoed by the Taz and other decisors of his time as well, and the Trumas Hadeshin, who also was a decisor for minhag Ashkenaz. Okay, so when we say that the Mechaber, who's basically the Sephardic approach, what we're talking about over here, one could be lenient even to eat the yolk, even if it's still slightly reddened by being attached to the chicken. Okay, and so so it seems like that should be permitted, but the Shach doesn't really feel that should be the case, and really. The only permission that you're getting should be to eat them with milk. Okay, that's instantly what they say. But other people disagree with that, and they say that if you still find the eggs inside the chicken after you've slaughtered the chicken, okay. So he says that would be permitted to eat as long as they've separated somewhat from it. Okay. So this is sort of the issue as it goes on over here. So this is part of the problem is whether or not we have to be concerned about this Rabbi Yaakov opinion over here. This problem is raised by the Taz and the Marshal, which is that if you're going to say that they're permitted, the problem would be is that you could technically take these eggs out of the chicken at this point and cook them because you don't need to shech the chicken. So the problem is that if you struck the chicken, okay, let's say something struck the chicken and it knocked out some of the eggs, okay. So in Siman Pei Vav in chapter 86, number 4, it says those eggs are not permitted, okay. They are a problem of Avram and Achai. And now note, there's other prohibition of where you can't take, for example, you couldn't rip the wing off of the chicken while it was still alive and eat that, and then shecht it afterwards, because there's a separate prohibition of eating a limb torn from a live animal. So it's difficult to say that if something struck the chicken and eggs fell out of it, how would we differentiate that between the eggs that were found in it after shechitah and eggs that fall out of it as a result of a strike? Okay, because they're saying that that's like a part of it falling out. So the Taz basically argues that that basically there's a difference between striking the chicken and finding it inside of it after shechitah. Okay? So as long as they're still attached to the chicken inside the chicken after shechitah, they're considered part of the chicken, but it's not because it's part of the chicken. It's because it's still inside the chicken. So striking it is different, because striking it means it would have technically have stayed there. So really, the prohibition is really a rabbinic one. And so the shach offers another possibility, because when you strike the chicken, even though it's not really considered meat, it's also not permitted to go ahead and eat it because it looks like Aver Minachai. Okay, so therefore that's the permission for it. So since there was permission to eat eggs that come out of chickens, because the Torah has permitted us to eat those chickens, as long as it's not considered attached, that would be permitted after shechitah. But if it's coming out of the chicken as a result of striking it, that looks too much like Aver Minachai. And so therefore they would remain as prohibited items themselves. Okay? And so that's why those things are prohibited. Okay. So one last interesting thing over here is we said that according to the Beis Yosef, one could go ahead and eat cheese after these eggs that had a fully formed yolk. So the reason why is because they are considered a separate thing, and they don't really look like the meat at all. Okay, and so therefore they're not really considered part of the chicken. And again, that is also another thing that they point out over here, is that waiting is also only a stringency, and there's also the flavor of meat that gets left in your mouth. And these things we see clearly are eggs. Okay. However, the Gra takes a completely different approach from all of these things, and he says the following. He says that since the meat of chicken is only prohibited rabbinically, there's no reason to extend it to the eggs. Okay, and he also quotes Tosfos that technically, according to them, one could eat cheese immediately after having consumed the meat of fowl. Okay, and so therefore, if it was only a stringency for us to do that, to apply it to the eggs as well, would have been a stringency on top of a stringency. Okay, so it's something interesting to think about. Okay, and so, but most people say that some Sephardi poskim say anyway that you really shouldn't rely on this leniency if there's still somewhat attached to the chicken. Okay, so to summarize this whole thing over here, we learned that this is where this halacha takes us. So here's what we learned from this sif today. So we learned in the Gemara that if you shech the chicken and you find eggs in it, they're permitted to be eaten with milk, and that Rabbi Yaakov limits that to those who are still attached with little gidin. That's prohibited. Okay, so we saw that there's a machlokas about Rabbi Yaakov. Do we pasuk Rabbi Yaakov? Do we not pasuk Rabbi Yaakov? So most people hold that Rabbi Yaakov as a stringency, and it's a machlokas rishonim as to whether or not we include that stringency in here or not. So what are the four approaches of the rishonim in this section? So Rashi says that if it's still slightly attached, but it looks like a yolk, that's okay, and the Rosh agrees with him. The Rashba pretty much agrees with him, but it requires it has to be egg white on there, and that's also the Ran as well. Okay, so but they're all slightly attached. Then there's the opinion of the Rashbam, which is mentioned by the Mordechai, and the Yesh Omrim in the Rashba and the Torah Sabayas, who says that it has to have a shell. And then there's Rabbi Yehonasan who says, whatever, it has to have like a little bit of a membrane. And that seems to be the opinion of the Rif, who and these are approaches whom accept Rabbi Yaakov's Me'uros Begidin as a problem. So therefore it has to be removed enough to no longer have these little red lines across it. So halacha is that the Mechaber and the Ramah hold like the Rashba, that basically has to have a yolk and a white, and therefore one can rely on Rashi in time of great need. Okay, but the Shach says that you should always be strict, like the Yeshomim in the Rashban require to have a shell, and he says that's the minhag of the women of his community, and this gets echoed by other Achronim in and around him as well. The Sephardi custom seems to be that one could be somewhat lenient, but at the very least it should have a yolk and a white in it, and that no one's lenient for less than that nowadays. Okay, and also we agree that no matter what, when you're eating these eggs, even though they're quote unquote fleshig eggs, they don't make you actually fleshig. So that's some of those rules there by that, and the Ramah would agree with that as well. Okay, and so therefore, one of the things that we can see over here is that if you have a soup with these fleshig eggs in it, and there's no other meat in the soup, one should not be eating it in a dairy meal, but one could go ahead and have a dairy immediately after such a soup. Thank you for listening to our class tonight. We look forward to joining us next time when we talk about different forms of cooking, which will be smoked and cooked in Chame Tiveria, meaning cooked in waters that are hot springs.